Listen, Dale Evans once confessed to a room that had gone very quiet. My life was messed up too, and I suppose in one way or another I have broken all of God's commandments in some way. It was not the kind of admission anyone expected from the Queen of the West. Not from the woman in the rhinestone boots and embroidered fringe, the one who rode buttermilk into America's living rooms every week with a smile so steady it could have been painted on. But Dale Evans said it anyway, deliberately, late in her life, when the cameras were finally gone and the need to perform had run out of time. She said it because she had carried too much for too long, and what she was finally willing to reveal about the son she was forced to deny, the daughter she buried twice in her heart, the husband the public worshipped, and the private life that bore little resemblance to the legend, is a story far more human and far more devastating than the one Hollywood ever let her tell. This is the truth Dale Evans kept quiet for half a century, and it turns out nothing about it was simple. To understand what she was protecting, you have to understand what she had built. By the early 1950s, Dale Evans and Roy Rogers were not merely entertainers. They were architecture. They were the scaffolding of a particular American faith, in decency, in loyalty, in the idea that good people ride toward the sunset and leave the darkness behind them. Every week, 50 million families arranged themselves around their television sets and watched Roy tip his hat and Dale sing with quiet conviction, and they believed, because they needed to, that some lives really did look exactly like that. The cultural weight of that image was immense, and the silence required to maintain it was heavier still. The most surprising part is not what was hiding behind the image. It is how early the hiding began. She was not born Dale Evans. She was born Frances Octavia Smith on a Halloween in 1912 in Uvalde, Texas. And the name itself tells you something. It was a name for a girl who would have to become someone else to survive. Her childhood moved between instability and improvisation, eventually landing her in the home of her uncle, a physician in Uvalde, Arkansas, where stability was meant but not entirely delivered. By 14, Frances had made the kind of decision that only desperation or wild hope could explain. She eloped with a man named Thomas F. Fox, a boy she believed would give her an anchor. By 15, she had a son. By 16, she was alone. Thomas Fox abandoned her in Memphis, Tennessee, and left her standing at the edge of a life she had not chosen, holding a child she adored and no visible path forward. She could have disappeared. Instead, she found her way to a radio station microphone. She sang. She played piano. She refused, with a ferocity that no one thought to document at the time, to become a cautionary tale. It was a station manager in Louisville who gave her the new name, Dale Evans, crisp and bright and easy on the announcer's tongue. She took it without hesitation, because Frances Smith with a baby and a failed marriage was not a name that opened doors in 1929. Dale Evans, however, was a name that moved. The jazz clubs responded. The radio audiences leaned in. The screen tests followed, and then came Hollywood, and then came the condition that would haunt her for years. Studio executives at 20th Century Fox delivered the requirement without ceremony. Tommy was not her son. Tommy was her younger brother, a devoted sister caring for a boy. That was the story, and she would live inside it or she would not live inside Hollywood. She chose to stay. She performed the lie every time a reporter asked, every time a camera appeared, and she kept performing it for years while Tommy grew up knowing exactly who his mother was and exactly why she could not say so. That wound did not close when the charade ended, it calcified. Even decades later, after her marriage to Roy had given her permission to acknowledge her son openly, Dale admitted that the years of denial had quietly eroded something in her sense of self. An authenticity she spent the rest of her life trying to recover. By 1944, having survived 2 additional marriages that offered neither lasting love nor particular happiness, Dale was cast opposite Roy Rogers in The Cowboy and the Senorita, and whatever the script required of them, the chemistry that developed between them required nothing at all. It simply was. Both were still married to other people, a fact that shaped their relationship into something careful and controlled, a friendship that dared not name itself. Then, in 1946, Roy's wife Arlene died shortly after the birth of their son, and the landscape between them changed. Grief has a way of stripping pretense. Dale, who had known abandonment and loss since she was barely a teenager, recognized Roy's sorrow in a language she did not have to translate. She became a steady presence, Steady became close, eventually became love, and on the night before a Chicago rodeo in late 1947, Roy Rogers proposed to Dale Evans while sitting on Trigger, his famous Palomino, as if the story of their courtship had always been scripted for the widest possible screen. On the last day of that year, they married at a ranch in Oklahoma, and for the first time in Dale's life, a beginning felt like it might actually hold for a while. It did. Roy's 3 children became hers. Her son Tommy finally had a father who claimed him publicly. Their blended, improbable family settled into something that resembled, from a distance, the image they were selling to the nation. But distance is the word, because the closer you stood to the life of Dale Evans Rogers, the more clearly you saw what the cameras were not designed to capture. In 1950, Dale gave birth to their only biological child together. Robin Elizabeth Rogers was born with Down syndrome and a host of additional medical complications, and she entered the world at a moment when such diagnoses were spoken of in hushed and apologetic tones, when the prevailing wisdom, if it deserves to be called wisdom, counseled parents to place such children quietly out of sight and tell visitors as little as possible. Hollywood, with its relentless investment in the flawless, had its own version of that advice ready to deliver. Dale and Roy rejected it entirely. They brought Robin home. They loved her openly. They made no apologies and offered no concealment, and in doing so, they quietly committed an act of rebellion so gentle that most observers did not recognize it as rebellion at all. For 21 months, Robin Elizabeth was present in their lives with a fullness that defied every prediction. Then, in 1952, just weeks before her 2nd birthday, she died from complications related to her condition, and something in Dale broke in a way that no previous loss had managed. This was not abandonment, which she had survived. This was not failure, which she knew how to outrun. This was a child. This was irreversible. What she did with that grief is the thing that separates Dale Evans from almost every other celebrity of her era. She wrote it down, not in a diary hidden from view, but in a book published for the world. Angel Unaware, narrated as if Robin herself were speaking from heaven, recounting her short life and the purpose she had carried into it. Hollywood was stunned. Parents across the nation wept and wrote letters. The book became a vessel for thousands of families who had been told, implicitly or explicitly, that their grief over children born with disabilities was somehow less legitimate, somehow private to the point of invisibility. Dale made it visible. Organizations dedicated to the care and inclusion of children with developmental disabilities took strength from the attention her words generated in Oklahoma. A council renamed its Center for Mentally Challenged Children in Robin's honor. A short life, 21 months long, had become a legacy that outlasted decades. That is not a small thing, that is by any measure everything. Yet the public warmth of that legacy coexisted with private cracks that Dale only began to name openly in the final years of her life. Roy Rogers, beloved by millions as the gentlest of cowboys, was strict at home in ways that strained the household. The easy television smile that families trusted on Friday evenings bore little relationship to the demanding, rigid father his children navigated in private. Dale, who had survived her own childhood by learning to adapt to difficult men, adapted again. She did not speak of it publicly while Roy was alive, but in later years she said it plainly. The man audiences adored and the man she lived with were not always the same man. The gap between them was not dramatic enough for scandal, but it was wide enough for loneliness. And loneliness was something Dale knew in that marriage, in a very specific way. The loneliness of Roy's extended absences for filming, for touring, for the professional obligations that kept him perpetually somewhere she was not. Fame, she admitted, had no remedy for that particular ache. Then 1964 arrived and broke them open again. Debbie, their 12-year-old adopted daughter, was killed when a church bus accident took her life, with a sudden, senseless violence that makes grief feel like a physical assault. Roy and Dale stood before cameras in the weeks that followed and performed the resilience the public required of them. Because that is what icons do privately. Dale would later describe that period as one of the darkest she had ever inhabited. The loss of Debbie reopened the wound of Robin with a precision that felt almost intentional, as though sorrow had decided to make its point twice. They eventually left their ranch in Chatsworth, its walls too saturated with memory, and relocated to Apple Valley in California. The geography changed, the grief did not. What changed was Dale's voice. From that point forward, her speeches, her books, her interviews took on the honesty of someone who had stopped calculating the cost of truth. The cheerful cowgirl image, constructed so carefully by a studio decades earlier, began, slowly and deliberately, to give way to the real woman underneath. She wrote more than a dozen books. She campaigned for the values she believed in, advocating loudly for faith in public life, for prayer in schools, for the moral architecture she felt the country was losing. She was not always easy to agree with. She was always impossible to dismiss. Because underneath the convictions was someone who had earned her certainties the hard way. Through loss, through reinvention, through the specific exhaustion of maintaining an image that never quite fit the life it was supposed to describe. Roy Rogers died on July 6, 1998, and took with him 50 years of shared history, shared loss, and the particular intimacy of two people who had watched each other grieve the same children. Dale was 85. She had 3 years left. She used them honestly, freed from the imperative to protect a partnership still in progress. She spoke with the directness of someone who no longer had time for softening. She talked about the loneliness. She talked about Roy's strictness. She talked about the long corrosive years of denying that Tommy was her son, and how even after the lie had ended, its residue had never quite left her. None of these admissions were made in bitterness. Her daughter Dodie would later explain that Dale believed a full life necessarily contains both joy and suffering, and that sharing both, honestly without performance, is its own form of courage. She was not dismantling Roy's legacy. She was completing her own. Dale Evans died on February 7, 2001, at 88 years old, 3 years a widow. Calm by all accounts in her final days, oriented toward reunion rather than reckoning. What she left behind is not tidy. Her story resists the clean arcs that Hollywood prefers. The unambiguous hero's journey, the marriage without shadow, the faith untouched by doubt. Her story is messier and more honest than that. It is the story of a girl from Texas who reinvented herself so many times, she nearly forgot which version was true, then spent the second half of her life fighting her way back to the original. It is the story of a mother who loved her children. All of them. The acknowledged and the hidden, the briefly living and the prematurely gone, with a ferocity that no studio could script and no scandal could diminish. The Queen of the West was never just a queen. She was a woman who buried children, carried secrets, outlasted heartbreak, and eventually, at the end of all of it, chose truth over image. That is a harder thing than riding buttermilk into a Texas sunset. It is harder than any song she ever sang, and it may be the most important thing she ever did. What do you think? Should Dale have spoken these truths sooner, or was there something right about waiting until she had lived all the way through them? Leave your thoughts below. And if stories like hers, the real lives behind the legends, are what you come here for, subscribe. There are more of them, and none of them are simple.